Welcome to our deep dive today, and we're going to be talking all about Thabo Mbeki, South Africa's second president after Nelson Mandela, of course. And we've got some pretty cool sources for this one. We've got his Wikipedia bio, some of his most interesting quotes, and a great profile from the Nelson Mandela Foundation.
Mhm.
I think you're going to see just from these sources that Mbeki is a really interesting figure in South African history. He was, praised for some of his economic policies, his foreign policy, but also really heavily criticized, especially for his approach to the HIV/AIDS crisis. So let's just dive right in and see if we can unpack his complicated legacy.
You know what really strikes me about Mbeki is that his early life was like almost set up for him to go into politics. I mean, he once said that he was born into the struggle. And you can see that. I mean, imagine growing up with portraits of Karl Marx and Mahatma Gandhi on your walls.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
it's quite a childhood. And it wasn't just the pictures on the walls either, right? His father, Govan Mbeki, was a huge figure in the ANC, in the South African Communist Party. I mean, this is a man who was imprisoned alongside Nelson Mandela during the Rivonia trial. So those political roots run really, really deep in the family.
Absolutely. And I mean, it was kind of inevitable that Mbeki would follow a similar path, you know? Like many in the ANC, during apartheid, he had to leave South Africa. He left at the age of 20 and went into exile for almost 3 decades to continue the fight against apartheid, obviously.
Yeah, it's exile's such a hard thing, and it's such an important experience for so many people. It must have been so formative for him. I mean, 3 decades abroad, I mean, that's a huge part of your life. It must have solidified his commitment to the struggle. Can we talk a bit about what he actually did during those years? It seems like his time in exile is really important for understanding his later decisions as president.
Yeah, for sure. Those years were key for understanding Mbeki. During his time in exile, he studied economics in England, which probably laid the groundwork for a lot of his economic policies as president. He also spent time in the Soviet Union and received training in Marxist-Leninist ideology, which, definitely influenced his thinking. But you have to remember that he wasn't just copying the Soviets or anything. He was constantly adapting and shaping these ideas to fit the South African context.
So it's really interesting that while many back in South Africa saw the ANC as a threat, Mbeki was working hard abroad to change how they were perceived around the world. He was living in Lusaka, Zambia, and heading up the ANC's information and publicity department. He really repositioned them on the world stage. It went from this idea of terrorist organization to government in waiting. I mean, that's a huge shift.
Yeah, he was great at using narrative and publicity. But it wasn't all just PR. He was also super involved in those secret talks and negotiations with the South African government. These talks were really, really important in getting the ANC unbanned and getting political prisoners released, including his own father.
I think all this is so interesting. I mean, his exile is so important because it's not just historical context, but it's also like the place where his leadership style was shaped. It really shows his skills at strategy and diplomacy, and you can see how committed he was to the ANC's goals.
And that's what he brings back to South Africa when he returns in 1990, right? A new era was beginning, and he was ready to help lead South Africa into the future.
Yeah, it's really interesting. He was coming home not just as a former exile, but as someone who had honed his skills and as someone with a real vision for a post-apartheid South Africa. And it's only a few years later that he is in a position to put those ideas and that vision into action.
And when apartheid ended and South Africa had its first democratic elections in 1994, Mbeki became deputy president to Nelson Mandela. But he wasn't just any deputy president. Mandela even called him a de facto president.
A de facto president. What does that even mean? I mean, what was he doing that gave him so much power, even though he was just the deputy president?
Well, it shows just how much influence Mbeki had. He was already pushing for major economic policy changes and was a really important part of South African foreign policy. It was a really exciting time for South Africa, and he was at the center of it all.
And that influence just kept growing, right? I mean, when he was elected president of the ANC in 1997, that easily paved the way for him to become president of South Africa a few years later. It's interesting that he just became president of the ANC without any opposition. It makes you wonder if that was the plan all along, like a carefully thought out transition of power.
Yeah, it definitely suggests that the ANC had a strategy. They wanted to make sure there was continuity and stability as the country moved out of the Mandela era. And Mbeki, with all his experience and his deep understanding of the party, he was seen as the perfect person to lead that transition.
So Mbeki becomes president.
Yeah.
And he has all these plans and this vision for South Africa, this vision that he's been forming for years. What were his main priorities? What did he really want to focus on?
He was really focused on two main areas, the economy and foreign policy. For the economy, he really pushed for the Growth, Employment, and Redistribution Program, or GEAR, as it's usually called. He was really involved in developing it even before he became president.
Year. And that's something you hear a lot about when you read about Mbeki. It seems like people had a lot of different opinions about it. Why was that?
Well, I mean, the name itself suggests this balance between economic growth and social equality. But a lot of people, especially those who lean left politically, argued that it was too focused on neoliberal policies, that it cared more about economic growth than social development. They felt like it was a move away from the ANC's traditional socialist leanings, because it focused on things like fiscal discipline, privatization, and trade liberalization.
Yeah, I can see how that would cause some debate, especially in a country that had such high levels of poverty and inequality. But were there any good things that came out of GEAR?
Oh, absolutely. Under Mbeki, the South African economy did really well. The economy grew, public debt went down, and inflation started pretty low. The average GDP growth was 4.2% every year, and inflation was at 5.7%. Those are not small achievements.
So it's kind of a mixed bag then. Some good things happened, but there were also concerns about who was actually benefiting. It makes you think about that question that every country struggles with. How do you balance economic growth with social justice?
Yeah, exactly. It's really hard to get that balance right. And in Mbeki's case, while his policies did help in some ways, a lot of people felt like the benefits weren't shared fairly.
So let's switch gears a little bit
Yeah.
and talk about Mbeki's foreign policy. This is another area where he really wanted to make a difference. He talked about this African Renaissance. What did he mean by that?
Mbeki was a really strong Pan-Africanist. He believed that Africa had so much potential and that South Africa could be a leader in helping the continent grow stronger. The African Renaissance was about African countries working together more. It was about depending less on help from Western countries and creating a continent that was powerful on the world stage.
So it sounds like he wanted to completely change the balance of power, to have Africa become more assertive in global affairs.
Exactly. And he didn't just talk about it. He actually tried to make this vision happen. He was really involved in creating NEPAD, the new Partnership for Africa's Development.
Wait a minute, NEPAD. For those of us who don't know that much about international development, can you explain what NEPAD is and why it was so important to Mbeki?
Sure. NEPAD was kind of like Mbeki's vision for Africa put into action. It was a plan for promoting good governance, economic development, and stronger ties between countries in Africa. The idea was to create a continent that would attract investment, increase trade, and help people escape poverty. It was all about moving away from relying on aid and becoming self-sufficient.
That sounds really ambitious.
Yeah.
Was he able to get other African leaders to support it? And was NEPAD successful?
Well, that's a complicated question. NEPAD was supported by a lot of African countries, and it did lead to some good initiatives. But there were also challenges. Some people were skeptical and thought it was really a plan pushed by Western countries. It's still debated whether it was truly successful or not.
It seems like there's always another layer to the story with Mbeki. He has all these big ideas and plans, but then there are always complications and criticisms.
You've hit on something important. Mbeki was a complicated guy, and it's hard to put him in a box.
And speaking of complicated, let's talk about Zimbabwe. Mbeki's way of dealing with Robert Mugabe's regime was really controversial. He used what he called quiet diplomacy, which I think means he was trying to work with Mugabe behind the scenes instead of openly criticizing him. Why did he do that, especially when there were so many human rights abuses happening in Zimbabwe?
Yeah, that's one of the most debated things about his foreign policy. There are a few possible reasons why he did that. Some people think he was trying to protect South Africa's economic interests. Because if Zimbabwe was unstable, it could hurt South Africa's economy too. Others think he was trying to maintain unity among African countries and thought that criticizing Mugabe publicly would make things worse.
That's interesting, because those two reasons, economic interests and African unity, seem almost like opposites. Like on one hand, he's being pragmatic and realistic, and on the other hand, he's idealistic and committed to Pan-Africanism.
That's the thing about Mbeki. It's not always easy to separate his practical side from his idealistic side. They were both part of how he made decisions.
It makes you wonder if he really believed he could change Mugabe's mind. Like, if he thought this quiet diplomacy would somehow lead Mugabe to become more democratic.
It's possible.
Right.
Mbeki was a great negotiator, and he believed that talking could solve problems. But in the end, his approach to Zimbabwe didn't really work. Mugabe stayed in power, and things just kept getting worse in Zimbabwe.
So this quiet diplomacy was eventually followed by Mbeki helping to create a power-sharing agreement. Between Mugabe's party and the opposition in 2008, Did that agreement actually work?
Well, the idea was to make the country more stable and help create democratic reforms. But people criticized it because they felt like it just let Mugabe stay in power. The power-sharing agreement had a lot of problems, and it didn't really solve the underlying problems that were causing the crisis in Zimbabwe.
So another mixed bag then. Another one of Mbeki's ideas that sparked debate and leaves us with more questions than answers. It seems like this keeps happening. He has these big ideas and noble goals, but then things don't go as planned, and he ends up getting criticized.
You're right, and this is probably most clear when we look at how he responded to the HIV/AIDS crisis.
Right, that's the part of his legacy that's really hard to reconcile with all the other things he did. It seems like his response to HIV/AIDS was a huge mistake, one that had terrible consequences.
It was definitely the worst part of his presidency. It hurt a lot of people and really damaged his reputation.
This is actually a hard topic to talk about. It's really sensitive, and I don't want to downplay how much people suffered. But I do think it's important to understand what happened, to try and make sense of what Mbeki did or didn't do.
I agree. It's a topic that needs to be treated with sensitivity and nuance, but it's also really important if we want to understand Mbeki's legacy.
Okay, so let's be careful as we talk about this. What was Mbeki's stance on HIV/AIDS, and why was it so controversial?
The biggest issue is that his government was slow to start using antiretroviral drugs to treat people. They didn't want to make these life-saving drugs available through the public healthcare system, and that caused a lot of international outrage and had really bad consequences.
But why? Why would he resist giving people treatment? What was the reason for that decision?
That's a question a lot of people have. Part of it might have been that he was worried about how much it would cost to roll out such a big program, especially in a country that didn't have a lot of resources.
I guess that makes sense to a degree. But it still doesn't seem like a good enough reason to not give people access to treatment.
Right, and this is where things get even more complicated. Mbeki also didn't agree with what most scientists were saying about HIV and AIDS. He didn't think there was a clear link between getting HIV and developing AIDS. And he even listened to people who denied that AIDS was a real problem.
Really? I didn't realize he went that far. It seems like he had his own theories about what caused AIDS.
It does seem like he was looking for different explanations. He focused a lot on poverty and other social and economic problems as the main causes of the epidemic. And this skepticism he had, this not believing what most scientists were saying, that led him to not want to use antiretroviral drugs as the main way to treat AIDS.
I see. So it wasn't just about logistics or money. He actually disagreed with the accepted science. It sounds like he just understood the whole disease differently.
That's one way to look at it. And sadly, this disagreement with science had really bad consequences. Studies say that hundreds of thousands of people died in South Africa because treatment was delayed.
That's awful. It's so hard to understand how many people were lost. It feels like the government really failed those people.
It was definitely a terrible time in South Africa, and HIV/AIDS became a big part of how people saw Mbeki's presidency. It overshadowed a lot of the good things he did, it hurt his reputation internationally, and made people in South Africa lose faith in him, and that all contributed to his downfall.
It really shows that even really smart leaders with good intentions can make huge mistakes. Mistakes that have terrible consequences.
Yeah, and those mistakes often happen because people don't want to accept the truth, because they hold on to their own ideas even when the evidence says they're wrong.
Yeah, it's almost like a Greek tragedy or something. A leader brought down not by his enemies, but by his own choices. Makes you think, though, was it just this HIV/AIDS thing that caused his downfall? Or were there other things going on, too?
Well, HIV/AIDS definitely played a big part, but there were definitely some other things that contributed to him leaving office. Like, inside the ANC, there was a new rival who was gaining power. Jacob Zuma.
Oh, yeah, Zuma. He was so different from Mbeki.
Yeah.
Much more of a populist leader.
Yeah.
And much more in touch with the everyday members of the ANC.
Exactly. Zuma was able to connect with people emotionally in a way that Mbeki just couldn't. Mbeki was seen as more intellectual and maybe a little distant. Zuma presented himself as a champion for the poor and marginalized, the people who felt like they weren't benefiting from Mbeki's economic policies.
So there was this growing split in the ANC. You had Mbeki and his people who were focused on economic growth and being practical.
Yeah.
And then you had Zuma and his supporters who wanted more radical changes to fix social and economic inequality.
Yeah, it was a real clash of ideologies and personalities, and a clash for power. And this all came to a head at the ANC's national conference in Polokwane in 2007. It was this huge moment, a showdown between these two sides of the party. They were both fighting for control.
That conference has become like this legendary event. in ANC history, like a real turning point for the party and for South Africa. What was it like there? Can you describe what happened?
It was intense. There was so much tension. Like, everyone knew that the future of the ANC was at stake. There were thousands of delegates there from all different parts of the party. The debates were heated. The speeches were passionate. Each side was trying to convince everyone that they should lead the ANC.
And Zuma won in the end, right? He beat Mbeki and became president of the ANC, which basically meant that Mbeki's time as leader of the party was over.
It was a big win for Zuma and a big loss for Mbeki. It really shocked a lot of people in South Africa. It showed that the power in the ANC was shifting, away from Mbeki's more intellectual approach, and towards Zuma's more populist and maybe even confrontational style.
And wasn't Mbeki still the president of South Africa at that time? What happened after the conference? Did he just step down?
Not exactly. Technically, he still had a year left as president. But the ANC, now controlled by Zuma, had the power to remove him from office. And they didn't wait very long to do that.
So there was a lot of pressure for him to resign. Did he try to fight it? Or did he accept what was happening?
Well, Mbeki and his supporters did resist at first, but it was clear that Zuma had all the momentum. And then a judge ruled that there had been political interference in the corruption case against Zuma. And even though that ruling was later overturned, it made people think that Mbeki was trying to use the courts to get rid of Zuma.
So it sounds like everything was going wrong for Mbeki.
Yeah.
He lost control of the ANC. There was pressure for him to resign. And then this court ruling made him look even worse.
Wait.
What could he do?
Yeah, with all that pressure from his own party, Mbeki announced that he was resigning in September of 2008. It was a dramatic ending for a presidency that had started with so much hope, but then got bogged down in controversy and infighting.
And so that was the end of the Mbeki era. It's amazing that after all those achievements, he left office in such a controversial way. It's like his legacy will always be about unrealized potential.
There's definitely something tragic about his story, this super intelligent guy who was so dedicated to his country. But in the end, he was brought down by his own bad decisions and the changing politics of the time.
It makes you wonder how he felt about it all. Did he ever say he was sorry for any of his decisions? Especially about how he dealt with the HIV/AIDS crisis.
Publicly, he never really apologized or admitted he was wrong. He kept questioning the science around HIV/AIDS even after he left office. But in some of the things he wrote and said later on, you can see him trying to understand his choices and what it means to be a leader.
I guess everyone wants to believe they made the right choices, even when things go wrong. It's hard to admit you were wrong, especially when your mistakes have hurt so many people.
And for Mbeki, it wasn't just about pride. He really did believe that he was doing what was best for South Africa. He saw himself as someone who was protecting Africa from being controlled by the West, as someone who was creating a new path for the continent.
So how do we judge Thabo Mbeki's legacy? Was he a hero or a villain or something in between?
I don't think you can put him in a simple category like that. He was brilliant at strategy and negotiation. He had a real vision for South Africa, and he played a key role in helping the country transition to democracy. He was a champion for Pan-Africanism. He wanted a fairer world, and the South African economy grew a lot when he was president.
It seems like there's always a but with Mbeki.
But he made mistakes. He could be arrogant, and that sometimes stopped him from seeing what was really happening. He was stubborn and didn't want to admit when he was wrong or change his mind, and the way he handled HIV/AIDS will always be a part of his legacy.
So it's a complicated legacy, full of successes and failures, brilliance and mistakes. It shows that being a leader isn't about being perfect. It's about dealing with the messiness of power, making tough choices with incomplete information, and leaving behind a record that people will debate for years to come.
And that's what makes Mbeki such an interesting figure. He makes us think about what it really means to be a leader, to see both the good and the bad, and to understand that even leaders with the best intentions can make terrible mistakes.
Well, this has been quite a journey, learning about the life and times of Thabo Mbeki. We started with his early years as an activist in exile, and then we talked about his presidency, all the ups and downs and all the controversy. Hope this has helped you understand this complicated and fascinating leader a little bit better.
And remember, this deep dive is just a starting point. There are so many other things you can explore. His writing, his speeches, all the books and articles about him. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep coming to your own conclusions about this complex and controversial leader.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of Thabo Mbeki. We hope you enjoyed it, and we encourage you to keep learning about the amazing and complex history of South Africa.